The night Margaret Vance found herself locked outside in the December blizzard of 1881. She understood with perfect clarity that her stepfamily intended for her to die. Snow fell in thick curtains across Westcliff, Colorado, transforming the mining town into a landscape of white death. Margaret pressed herself against the locked door of the cabin she'd called home for the past 3 years, her thin cotton dress already soaked through, her fingers numb against the wood. She pounded again, knowing it was useless, hearing the muffled laughter of her stepmother and stepsisters inside. They'd waited until her father left for the mines that morning, then systematically removed every winter garment she owned, every blanket, every shred of warmth. When she'd protested, they'd shoved her into the Christmas Eve storm wearing nothing but her summer work dress and bare feet. "Please," Margaret called through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Please let me in." The only response was the scrape of furniture being dragged against the door. Margaret's father had remarried a year after her mother's death from consumption, bringing Constance Hewitt and her 2 daughters into their small home. At first, Margaret had hoped for companionship, for the family warmth she'd lost. Instead, she'd found herself relegated to servant status, sleeping in the shed behind the cabin, eating scraps, working from dawn until long past dark. Her father, gone for weeks at a time working the silver mines in the mountains, never saw how they treated her. When he was home, Constance played the doting stepmother, and Margaret kept silent, not wanting to burden him with more troubles when mining life already wore him down to nothing. But this was different. This was murder. Margaret stumbled away from the door, her feet already losing feeling in the snow. The temperature had dropped viciously as the sun set, and now the wind cut through her like knives. She needed shelter. The shed where she usually slept had been locked as well. She'd already tried it. The neighboring cabins were dark, their occupants either gone for the holiday or already asleep. The main street of Westcliff was empty, the saloons and shops closed for Christmas Eve. She made it perhaps 50 yards before her legs gave out. The snow was knee-deep here, and she collapsed into it, her body already beginning to shut down. 23 years old, and this was how her life would end, frozen in a Colorado blizzard while her stepfamily celebrated Christmas inside a warm cabin. Margaret thought of her mother, buried in the cemetery on the hill, and wondered if death would be like falling asleep. The cold stopped hurting after a while. That scared her more than the pain had. She didn't hear the horse approach, didn't register the presence until strong hands lifted her from the snow. Margaret tried to speak, but her jaw wouldn't work properly. She was dimly aware of being wrapped in something warm, of being lifted onto a horse, of a man's voice speaking low and urgent near her ear. "Stay with me now. Stay awake." Margaret tried to obey, but darkness pulled at her like a tide. When she opened her eyes again, heat surrounded her. Blessed, painful heat that made her extremities scream as blood returned to them. She was lying on a bed near a roaring fireplace, buried under multiple quilts and blankets, still wearing her wet dress, but with her feet wrapped in warm cloths. A man stood at the fireplace, his back to her, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that curled at his collar. He wore working clothes, denim and wool, and moved with the easy competence of someone accustomed to taking care of himself. Margaret tried to sit up, and the movement made him turn. He had a strong face, weathered by sun and wind, with dark eyes that assessed her quickly before he crossed to the bed. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but striking, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and a mouth that seemed more accustomed to serious expressions than smiles. She guessed him to be near 30. "Easy," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "You're not out of danger yet. How do your hands and feet feel?" "They hurt," Margaret managed, her voice hoarse. "That's good. Means there's no serious frostbite. You were lucky. Another 10 minutes and you'd have lost fingers or toes." He moved to a table near the fireplace, poured something from a kettle into a tin cup, brought it to her. "Drink this. Slow sips." The liquid was warm broth, rich with fat and salt. Margaret's hands shook too badly to hold the cup, so the man sat on the edge of the bed and held it to her lips while she drank. The intimacy of the gesture should have embarrassed her, but she was too grateful for the warmth spreading through her chest to care about propriety. "Thank you," she whispered when she'd finished half the cup. "You saved my life." "Fletcher Briggs," he said, setting the cup aside. "I own the ranch about 2 miles west of town. I was riding back from delivering supplies to the Henderson place when I saw you in the snow." His dark eyes studied her face. "What were you doing out in a blizzard wearing nothing but a cotton dress?" Margaret looked away, shame burning through her. "I was locked out. Locked out." His tone was flat, disbelieving. "On Christmas Eve in a blizzard, my stepfamily." The words came with difficulty. "They don't want me there." Fletcher was silent for a long moment. When Margaret risked a glance at him, his jaw was tight, a muscle working in his cheek. "They locked you out to freeze to death." It wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway. Fletcher stood abruptly, paced to the window, stared out at the storm still raging beyond the glass. "Which house?" "The Vance cabin on 3rd Street. But please don't say anything." "My father doesn't know, he's at the mines, and I can't prove anything, and Constance will just say I ran away or was causing trouble or your father." Fletcher turned to face her. "Benjamin Vance. Works the Lucky Strike mine." Margaret nodded. "I know him. Good man. Works hard." Fletcher's expression darkened. "He has no idea what they're doing to you. He's hardly ever home, and when he is, Constance is different. She acts like we're a happy family." Margaret's throat tightened. "I didn't want to burden him with more troubles." "The mining is dangerous enough without him worrying about home. So you let them treat you like a slave and then try to kill you." Fletcher's voice was hard, angry, but Margaret sensed the anger wasn't directed at her. "You're not going back there. I have nowhere else to go. You're staying here." He said it like it was already decided. "At least until your father comes back from the mines. Then we'll tell him what happened and let him deal with his wife and her daughters." Margaret struggled to sit up, ignoring the protests of her aching body. "I can't stay here. It wouldn't be proper. You're an unmarried man and I'm nearly dead from exposure." Fletcher cut her off. "I don't give a damn about propriety right now. The storm's going to last through tomorrow at least. You can't walk on those feet yet. And I'm not taking you back to people who just tried to murder you." He paused, seemed to be wrestling with something, then added in a gentler tone, "I have a spare room. You'll have privacy, and I promise you'll be safe here." The sincerity in his voice broke something loose inside Margaret. She'd been so alone for so long, had grown so accustomed to cruelty masquerading as family that simple kindness felt overwhelming. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Fletcher looked alarmed. "Did I say something wrong?" "No." Margaret wiped at her face with trembling hands. "You've been nothing but kind. I just can't remember the last time anyone was." Something shifted in Fletcher's expression, a softening around his eyes. He returned to the bedside, handed her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "Get some rest. We can figure everything else out tomorrow." But sleep felt impossible with so many emotions churning through her. "Why were you out in the storm?" "Old Mrs. Henderson's husband died last month. She doesn't have anyone to look after her, so some of us neighbors take turns making sure she has what she needs. I brought her firewood and supplies to last through Christmas." He shrugged. "Seemed like the right thing to do. That was kind of you, just being a decent human being, which seems to be rarer than it should be." He moved back to the fireplace, added another log. This is my main house. I built it 3 years ago when I bought the ranch. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and solid. I run cattle mostly, some horses. Do all right for myself." Margaret looked around the room properly for the first time. It was indeed simple but well built, with solid furniture and clean floors. Everything was orderly, functional, the home of a man who valued practicality over decoration. But there were small touches that spoke to more than mere survival. A row of books on a shelf, a framed photograph of an older couple on the mantel, curtains on the windows that someone had sewn with care. "Did you make those curtains?" Margaret asked. Fletcher glanced at them and his expression turned melancholy. "My mother made them, before she died. She and my father had a ranch in Kansas. They died within months of each other 5 years ago. I sold the Kansas property and came here to start fresh. I'm sorry, losing parents is hard. You lost your mother too. It wasn't a question. 3 years ago, consumption. My father tried to nurse her through it, but the illness was too strong." Margaret pulled the blankets closer. "She was kind, gentle. Everything Constance isn't. How long after she died did your father remarry?" "A year. He was lonely, I think, and Constance seemed capable and respectable. She had her daughters to support after her husband died in a mining accident. It seemed like a practical arrangement that would benefit everyone." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I was naive. I thought we'd become a real family. What happened instead?" The words came easier now, maybe because Fletcher listened without judgment, his dark eyes steady on her face. Margaret told him about the gradual shift after the wedding, how Constance's pleasant facade had dropped away once the marriage was legal, how she'd been moved to the shed, given the hardest work, fed the least, how her stepsisters, Prudence and Charity, had taken vicious pleasure in tormenting her, stealing her possessions, ruining her clothes, spreading rumors in town that she was simple-minded or mentally unwell. "They wanted me gone," Margaret said quietly. "But they couldn't just throw me out while my father was alive and providing for the family. So they made my life miserable, hoping I'd run away. When I didn't, when I endured it all because I had nowhere else to go, they decided tonight to solve the problem permanently." Fletcher's hands had curled into fists. "When does your father return from the mines?" "Usually around New Year's. He tries to be home for a few weeks between work periods. Then you'll stay here until he comes back. We'll tell him together what happened and he can decide what to do with his wife." Fletcher's tone brooked no argument. "But you're not going back there, Margaret, not ever." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I can work. I can earn my keep here. I'm strong and I know how to cook and clean and tend animals. I won't be a burden. You're recovering from nearly freezing to death. You don't need to earn anything." But Fletcher's expression softened slightly. "Though if you're set on helping, I won't stop you. The place could use a woman's touch, and I'm a terrible cook." The wind rattled the windows, reminding them both of the storm still raging outside. Margaret thought about where she'd be right now if Fletcher hadn't found her, frozen and dead in a snowbank, and a shudder ran through her that had nothing to do with cold. "Try to sleep," Fletcher said, noticing her reaction. "You're safe now, I promise." He moved toward the door, presumably to give her privacy, but Margaret found herself calling out, "Fletcher." He turned back. "Yes, thank you for everything, for finding me, for bringing me here, for believing me." Her throat tightened again. "For being kind." Something flickered in his dark eyes, something warm and complicated. "You don't have to thank me for basic decency, Margaret. Get some rest." He left, closing the door gently behind him, and Margaret was alone with the firelight and her thoughts. Despite everything that had happened, despite the trauma of the evening, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't sleeping in a freezing shed, wasn't wondering if she'd survive another day. She was warm and safe, and in the care of someone who actually seemed to care whether she lived or died. Margaret pulled the blankets up to her chin and let herself drift toward sleep, listening to the storm outside and the crackle of the fire, feeling more at peace than she had in longer than she could remember. When Margaret woke, sunlight streamed through the window despite the snow still falling steadily outside. Her body ached in 1,000 places, and her hands and feet throbbed with renewed pain as she flexed them experimentally. But she could move her fingers and toes, which meant Fletcher had been right about no serious frostbite. She sat up slowly, taking stock of her surroundings in the daylight. The room was small but comfortable, with the bed she'd slept in, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a simple chair by the window. Someone, Fletcher presumably, had left clean clothes folded on the chair, a wool dress in dark blue, heavy stockings, and even a warm shawl. The dress was too large, likely meant for someone taller and broader, but it would be infinitely better than the ruined cotton shift she still wore. A soft knock at the door made her start. "Margaret, are you awake?" "Yes," she called. "I'm leaving some water outside the door for washing." "Breakfast will be ready in about 20 minutes. Margaret waited until she heard his footsteps retreat, then opened the door to find a steaming pitcher of hot water and a towel. The simple consideration of it, the thoughtfulness, made her throat tight. She carried the pitcher to the washstand and cleaned herself as best she could, wincing at the bruises blooming across her skin from the cold and her collapse in the snow. When she dressed in the borrowed clothes, cinching the too large dress with her own belt, she ventured out of the bedroom. The main room of the cabin was larger than she'd realized, with the fireplace dominating one wall, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, a solid dining table with 4 chairs, and a sitting area with a well-worn sofa and more bookshelves. Everything was neat and orderly, but there was definitely a bachelor quality to the space, a lack of decoration or comfort beyond the purely functional. Fletcher stood at the stove, stirring something in a pan that smelled delicious. He'd changed into clean clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. When he heard her enter, he glanced over his shoulder. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, but alive." Margaret moved closer to the warmth of the stove. "Thank you for the clothes. They were my mother's. She was taller than you, but I thought they'd serve better than what you had." He ladled what looked like porridge into 2 bowls, added generous amounts of honey and cream. "Sit. You need to eat." Margaret obeyed, settling at the table while Fletcher brought the bowls over along with fresh coffee and biscuits left over from the previous day. The food was simple but good, and Margaret realized she was ravenously hungry. She ate steadily while Fletcher watched with what might have been satisfaction. "When did you last have a full meal?" he asked. Margaret had to think about it. "I usually ate scraps after my stepfamily finished, whatever they left. So I suppose I haven't had a real meal since my father was last home." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "That's criminal." "It was survival." Margaret met his eyes. "I learned not to expect kindness. It hurt less that way." They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Through the window, Margaret could see the barn and outbuildings, the shapes of cattle huddled together for warmth in a sheltered area. "The storm should clear by tonight," Fletcher said, following her gaze. "But we got at least 2 feet, maybe more. Town will be snowed in for a few days." "Will your animals be all right?" "They're hardy. I made sure they had shelter and extra feed before I left yesterday." He paused. "You said you know how to tend animals." "I grew up helping my father, Before he went to work the mines, he did odd jobs around town and I often helped him. I can milk cows, feed chickens, muck stalls, handle horses. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup. After my mother died, I took over all the household work. Constance said I was useless at first, but I learned quickly. Had to, or I wouldn't get fed at all. Fletcher's expression darkened again at the mention of her stepmother. She sounds like a real piece of work. She's bitter. Her first husband died and left her with 2 young daughters and no money. I think she saw my father as security and me as competition for his affection and resources. Margaret took a sip of coffee. Not that it excuses what she did, what she tried to do. No, it doesn't. Fletcher stood, collected their empty bowls. The question now is what happens next. I'll stay until my father comes home if you'll still have me. Then I'll tell him what happened. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. I don't know what he'll do. He loves Constance, or thinks he does. He might not believe me. He'll believe you when I confirm your story. I found you dying in the snow, wearing nothing but a cotton dress. That's not something you can lie about. Fletcher carried the bowls to the wash basin. But even if he believes you, even if he throws Constance out, what then? You can't stay in that cabin alone while he's at the mines for weeks at a time. It's not safe. I don't know, Margaret admitted. I've been so focused on just surviving day to day that I haven't thought about the future. Fletcher turned to face her, leaning against the counter. You could stay here. Margaret's heart jumped. I couldn't impose on you like that. It's not an imposition. I could use help around the ranch. The place is too much for one person to manage, especially in winter. I've been thinking about hiring someone for a while, but good help is hard to find. He paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. You could work for room and board at first. If it works out, I'd pay you wages too. Give you a chance to save money, maybe eventually get your own place if that's what you want. It was more than Margaret had dared to hope for. Independence, safety, a future that didn't involve begging her father for protection or finding some man desperate enough to marry a penniless woman with a ruined reputation. But doubt crept in, born from 3 years of learning that kindness always had a price. Why would you do this for me? She asked. You don't know me. Fletcher considered the question seriously. Because you deserve better than what you've been given. Because I know what it's like to lose the people who should protect you and have to make your own way in the world. Because I have the means to help and it seems wrong not to. He crossed his arms over his chest. And because I'm tired of living alone in this house with no one to talk to but cattle and horses. The honesty of that last statement made Margaret smile despite everything. You're lonely. I suppose I am. Fletcher's expression turned wry. I'm not much for social gatherings or town politics. I keep to myself mostly, focus on the work. But it gets quiet sometimes. Having someone else around, someone to share meals with and talk to, that would be good. I can talk, Margaret said softly. I've had very little chance to these past few years, but I used to be quite talkative. My mother said I could talk the ears off a mule. Fletcher's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Then it settled. You'll stay, help around the ranch, and we'll both be less lonely. Margaret felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. You've given me my life back. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't experienced my cooking on a regular basis. This time Fletcher did smile, and it transformed his face, softening the hard edges and making him look younger. Trust me, you'll earn your keep just by making sure we don't die of food poisoning. They spent the rest of Christmas Day getting to know each other. Fletcher showed Margaret around the cabin, explaining the household routines and where everything was kept. He was organized to the point of fastidiousness, with everything in its proper place. But he freely admitted he'd let certain things slide, like mending and proper cleaning, because they felt less urgent than the outdoor work. Margaret found herself relaxing in his presence. Fletcher had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he grew comfortable, and he listened when she spoke, really listened, his dark eyes attentive. He told her about building up the ranch, about the challenges of Colorado winters and the constant battle against predators and disease. He talked about his parents, how they'd taught him the value of hard work and treating people fairly. "My father used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he does when someone needs help," Fletcher said as they sat by the fire that evening, the storm finally beginning to clear outside. He lived by that. Would give the shirt off his back to someone who needed it. "He sounds like a good man." He was. So was my mother. They built something good together, a real partnership. Fletcher stared into the flames. "That's what I want someday, not just a wife but a partner, someone who'll work beside me and build a life together." Margaret felt her cheeks warm at the intimacy of the conversation. "You haven't found anyone." "Haven't really looked. Most women in town want someone more established, someone with more money and better prospects. And I'm not much for courting, all that fancy talk and pretending to be something I'm not." He glanced at her. "What about you? No young men courting you before your stepfamily took over." "There was someone once. Robert Mitchell. We'd known each other since childhood, and I thought maybe we'd marry eventually." Margaret's voice turned bitter. "But after Constance came, she spread rumors that I was touched in the head, that I had fits and violent tendencies. Robert heard the rumors and stopped calling. Everyone did." "That's cruel. That's Constance." Margaret pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "She wanted me isolated so no one would question my treatment or offer me a way out. It worked." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're not isolated anymore. And anyone who meets you can see you're perfectly sound. Constance's lies will be exposed for what they are." Margaret wanted to believe him, but 3 years of systematic emotional abuse had worn away her confidence. "What if people won't believe me? What if they take her word over mine?" "Then they're fools and you're better off without them." Fletcher stood, stretched. "But I think you'll be surprised. Not everyone in Westcliff is heartless. There are good people here who'll listen to the truth." Margaret hoped he was right. She thought about her father, about the conversation they'd need to have when he returned from the mines. Benjamin Vance had loved her mother deeply, and he'd tried to be a good father despite the demands of his work. But he'd also been blind to Constance's true nature, and Margaret feared he'd choose his wife over his daughter. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in Fletcher's spare room, Margaret let herself imagine a different future. One where she stayed on the ranch, learned the work, built a life of her own. Fletcher had been nothing but respectful and kind, but she'd felt something spark between them during their conversations, a connection that went beyond simple kindness. He was attractive in a rough way, strong and capable, but it was his character that drew her more. His integrity, his willingness to help someone in need, his dry humor and careful attention. She was developing feelings for her rescuer, and she had no idea what to do about it. The days after Christmas passed in a strange but pleasant rhythm. The snow stopped on the day after Christmas, and Fletcher spent long hours outside tending the cattle and checking for storm damage. Margaret insisted on helping despite his protests about her needing rest, and together they dug paths through the snow, broke ice on the water troughs, and made sure all the animals were healthy and fed. Margaret discovered she loved the work. It was hard and cold and exhausting, but it felt purposeful in a way her drudgery for Constance never had. Fletcher praised her efforts, taught her things she didn't know, treated her like a valued partner rather than a servant. At night, they'd return to the warm cabin, and Margaret would cook proper meals while Fletcher handled other chores, and they'd eat together and talk about everything and nothing. It felt like a life, a real life. And Margaret found herself dreading the moment her father would return and she'd have to face the mess of her past. A week after Christmas, on a brutally cold morning, Fletcher returned from checking the cattle with a serious expression. "I need to go into town for supplies. We're low on several things, and I want to check that Mrs. Henderson made it through the storm all right." Margaret's stomach clenched. "Will you see my stepfamily?" "Probably. Town's not that big." Fletcher pulled off his gloves, studied her face. "Do you want me to deliver a message?" "Tell them I'm alive." Margaret's voice came out stronger than she felt. "Tell them I'm working for you and won't be returning to their home. They don't need to know anything else." Fletcher nodded. "I can do that. Do you want to come with me?" Margaret considered it. Part of her wanted to hide, to avoid confronting Constance and her daughters. But another part, a stronger part that had been growing over the past week, wanted to face them head-on. "Yes, I'll come." They rode into Westcliff together. Margaret seated behind Fletcher on his sturdy roan gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. The contact felt intimate and right, and she wondered if he felt the same flutter in his chest that she did whenever they touched. Westcliff looked beautiful under its blanket of snow, the main street busy with people going about their post-storm business. Margaret felt eyes on them as they rode through town, felt the weight of curiosity and judgment. Fletcher seemed oblivious, or perhaps just unconcerned, nodding to people he knew as he guided the horse toward the general store. They just dismounted when Constance appeared on the boardwalk, her face pinched with cold and what might have been shock. Behind her, Prudence and Charity gaped openly. "Margaret," Constance said, her voice pitched loud enough for passers-by to hear. "Where have you been? We've been so worried. You ran off on Christmas Eve and we've been frantic." The lie was so smooth, so believable, that for a moment Margaret felt reality shift. But then Fletcher's hand settled on her lower back, steady and supportive, and she found her voice. "You locked me outside during the blizzard," Margaret said clearly. "You took my winter clothes, barred the doors, and left me to freeze to death." Constance's expression shifted to wounded disbelief. "What a terrible thing to say. You know that's not true. You've been having these episodes, these delusions, and your father and I have been so worried. You must have wandered off during one of your fits." It was exactly the story Constance would tell, the culmination of 3 years of planted rumors about Margaret's mental state. Margaret felt panic rising, felt the old helplessness threatening to swallow her. But Fletcher stepped forward, his presence solid and imposing. "I found Margaret collapsed in a snowbank 2 miles from your cabin, wearing nothing but a cotton dress, nearly dead from exposure," he said, his voice carrying down the street. "That's not a delusion. That's attempted murder." Constance's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the vicious woman underneath. Then she recovered, turned to the gathering crowd with tears in her eyes. "The poor girl is clearly unwell, and now she's convinced this kind man of her delusions. Benjamin will be heartbroken. We've tried so hard to care for her, but her condition only worsens." "Shut your lying mouth," Fletcher said flatly. "I know what I saw. I know what I found. And when Benjamin gets back from the mines, he's going to hear the truth about how you've been treating his daughter." "You're a fool if you believe her stories," Prudence spoke up, her pretty face twisted with malice. "She's been trouble since Papa married our mother, lazy and spiteful and always causing problems." "Is that why you let her sleep in a shed and fed her scraps?" Fletcher asked. "Because she was causing problems," the crowd was murmuring now, some people looking skeptical of Constance's story. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Maybe Fletcher had been right. Maybe people would listen to the truth. An older woman pushed through the crowd. "Mrs. Anderson, who ran the boarding house. I've seen that girl working like a slave while her stepsisters promenaded around in new dresses. Always thought something wasn't right in that household. Benjamin's wife has always been cold, someone else muttered. Poor Margaret lost her mama and got stuck with that harpy. Constance's expression turned calculating. If you've been sheltering my stepdaughter, Mr. Briggs, in your home, alone, then her reputation is already in tatters. No decent man will have her now. Perhaps you should marry her and make an honest woman of her, since you've compromised her so thoroughly. The suggestion hung in the air like a threat. Margaret felt her face burn with humiliation. Leave it to Constance to twist rescue into something sordid. But Fletcher simply looked at Constance with contempt. Margaret has been staying in my spare room, properly chaperoned by her own good character. If anyone's reputation should be in question, it's yours. You tried to murder your stepdaughter. That's not something this town will forget. He took Margaret's arm, guided her toward the general store. Come on. Let's get what we need and go home. Home. The word resonated in Margaret's chest. Fletcher's ranch felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since her mother died. They completed their shopping in tense silence, aware of the stares and whispers following them. Mrs. Anderson approached as they were leaving, pressed Margaret's hand. You stay with Mr. Briggs, dear. Don't you go back to that woman. She's poison. Thank you, Margaret whispered. Outside, Fletcher loaded their supplies onto the horse while Margaret waited, trying to ignore Constance's venomous glare from across the street. They were about to mount up when a familiar figure appeared at the end of the street, riding a tired-looking mule. Margaret's heart stopped. Papa. Benjamin Vance looked older than the last time she'd seen him, his face gaunt and weathered from weeks in the mines. But his eyes lit up when he saw her, and he urged the mule forward. Margaret, what are you doing in town? I thought you'd be home helping Constance prepare for New Year. Before Margaret could answer, Constance rushed forward, throwing herself into Benjamin's arms with dramatic sobs. Oh, Benjamin, thank God you're home. It's been such a terrible week. Margaret had one of her episodes and ran away, and we've been searching everywhere. And now she's saying the most horrible things about us, claiming we locked her out in the storm when we were only trying to protect her. Benjamin looked confused and exhausted. What's she talking about, Margaret? This was it. The moment that would determine everything. Margaret stepped forward, forced herself to meet her father's eyes. Papa, I need to tell you the truth about what's been happening while you've been at the mines. Constance and her daughters have been mistreating me. They made me sleep in the shed, fed me scraps, worked me like a servant. And on Christmas Eve, they locked me outside in the blizzard with no winter clothes, intending for me to die. Mr. Briggs found me and saved my life. Benjamin's face went slack with shock. He looked between Margaret and his wife, clearly struggling to process her words. Constance, she's delusional, Benjamin. You know she's been having these fits, these strange episodes. We've been caring for her as best we can, but she's getting worse. Constance's tears looked absolutely genuine. I think she needs to be sent to an institution where trained doctors can help her. No. Benjamin's voice was quiet but firm. He gently disentangled himself from Constance, moved to stand in front of Margaret. My daughter is not delusional. She's never been delusional. What's this about sleeping in the shed? The doubt in Constance's eyes was almost imperceptible, but Margaret saw it. Her stepmother had overplayed her hand. Show me, Benjamin said to Margaret. Show me where you've been sleeping. They walked as a group to the cabin on 3rd Street, the crowd following at a distance like spectators at a drama. Benjamin pushed open the door to the shed behind the house, took in the thin blanket on the bare floor, the lack of any heat source or comfort. His face went white with fury. How long? He asked Margaret. 2.5 years. Benjamin turned to Constance with an expression Margaret had never seen on her father's face before, pure, cold rage. "Get your daughters. Pack your things. You have 1 hour to be out of my house." "Benjamin, you can't mean that." "She's lying, she's sick, 1 hour," Benjamin repeated. "Or I'll have the sheriff throw you out, and if I ever see you near my daughter again, I'll have you arrested for attempted murder." Constance's mask finally shattered completely. "You're throwing us out for that worthless girl. After everything I've done for you, we have nowhere to go. You should have thought of that before you tried to kill my daughter." Benjamin's voice shook. "I trusted you. I brought you into my home, gave you and your daughters everything, and you repaid me by torturing my child. Get out." Prudence and Charity had been watching from the cabin doorway, and now they burst into tears, clinging to their mother. "Mama, what will we do? Where will we go?" "You'll figure it out," Fletcher said coldly. "Same way Margaret would have had to if she'd survived the storm." The next hour was chaos. Constance and her daughters packed their belongings while Benjamin watched, stone-faced and silent. Neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle, and Margaret heard the whispers spreading, the truth replacing Constance's lies. By the time the three women left, their possessions loaded on a borrowed cart, the whole town knew what had happened. Benjamin stood in the doorway of his cabin, looking 10 years older than he had an hour before. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I should have known. I should have seen." Margaret went to him, let him fold her into his arms. "You couldn't have known. She was careful, and I didn't want to burden you. You're my daughter. You could never be a burden." Benjamin pulled back, studied her face. "Mr. Briggs, I owe you a debt I can never repay." "You saved my daughter's life." Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. "Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Benjamin said quietly, "not everyone would have, and not everyone would have taken her in and protected her after." He looked between them, seemed to notice something in how they stood close together, in the way Margaret unconsciously leaned toward Fletcher. "She can come home now, though I understand if she'd prefer to stay with you." The question hung in the air. Margaret looked at her father, at the guilt and sorrow in his face, and felt love and forgiveness warring with the knowledge that this cabin held too many bad memories. Then she looked at Fletcher, at his steady presence, and the way his dark eyes softened when they met hers, and she knew her answer. "I've agreed to work for Mr. Briggs on his ranch," Margaret said. "Room and board in exchange for help around the property. I think I'd like to continue that arrangement, at least for now, if that's all right with you, Papa." Relief flickered across Benjamin's face. "If that's what you want." "And if Mr. Briggs is agreeable." "More than agreeable," Fletcher said. "Margaret's been a tremendous help this past week. I'm lucky to have her." They worked out the details while standing in the cold. Benjamin would be home for 2 weeks before returning to the mines, and Margaret would visit regularly. Fletcher would ensure she had everything she needed, and Benjamin would pay him for Margaret's care, though Fletcher protested that wasn't necessary. In the end, they compromised. Margaret would work for Fletcher, and if either party was unsatisfied with the arrangement, they'd revisit the situation. As they rode back to the ranch that evening, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. The truth was out. Constance was gone. Her father believed her and loved her. She had a future that didn't involve cruelty or fear, and she had Fletcher, whose solid warmth at her back felt like the safest place in the world. "Thank you," she said softly, her cheek against his shoulder blade, "for standing up for me today, for telling everyone the truth." "You don't have to thank me for that either." Fletcher's voice rumbled through his chest. "I just told the truth. Your stepmother is a vicious woman who tried to kill you. Everyone needed to know that. Still, it meant everything." Margaret tightened her arms around his waist. "You've given me my life back." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're giving me something too, you know." "What's that?" a reason to come home at the end of the day, someone to talk to, someone who sees me as more than just the quiet rancher who keeps to himself." He paused. "You make the house feel like a home." Margaret's heart swelled. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just held him closer, and they rode through the winter twilight in comfortable silence. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to their lives. Margaret threw herself into ranch work with determination, proving herself capable in ways that surprised even Fletcher. She was strong from years of hard labor under Constance, and she learned quickly. Fletcher taught her how to handle the horses, how to repair fences, how to read the weather and anticipate problems. In turn, Margaret transformed the cabin, cleaning and organizing, mending clothes and linens, cooking meals that actually tasted good. But it was more than just working together. They talked constantly, sharing stories and dreams and quiet observations. Fletcher told her about his plans to expand the ranch, maybe buy more land and increase his herd. Margaret shared her love of reading, and Fletcher gave her free access to his collection of books, watching with obvious pleasure as she devoured one after another. They developed small rituals. Morning coffee together before starting the day's work. Evening meals eaten at the table with the good dishes, not rushed or functional but savored. Reading aloud to each other on cold nights, taking turns with the books, their voices filling the warm cabin. Margaret visited her father regularly, and Benjamin made an effort to get to know Fletcher better, clearly approving of the man who'd saved his daughter and given her a place to flourish. The town's attitude toward Margaret shifted as well. Without Constance poisoning everyone against her, people saw Margaret for who she really was: intelligent, hardworking, kind. She made friends, real friends, for the first time in years. But through it all, Margaret was acutely aware of her growing feelings for Fletcher. She caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the strength of his body and the competence of his movements. She treasured every smile he gave her, every moment when his hand would brush hers in passing, every evening when they'd sit close on the sofa and their shoulders would touch. She was falling in love with him, had probably already fallen, and she had no idea if he felt the same. Fletcher was careful with her, respectful to a fault. He never touched her inappropriately, never made her feel uncomfortable or unsafe. But sometimes she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something warm and intense that made her breath catch. And he found excuses to be near her, to work alongside her when he could just as easily work alone, to linger over meals and extend their evening conversations late into the night. Winter deepened into January, and one evening after a particularly hard day fixing a section of fence that had collapsed under snow weight, they sat by the fire in comfortable exhaustion. Margaret was mending one of Fletcher's shirts, her hands working the needle with practiced ease, while Fletcher pretended to read a book but kept glancing at her over the pages. "Margaret," he said finally, setting the book aside, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." She looked up from her mending. "Are you happy here? Truly happy?" Fletcher's dark eyes were serious. "Because if you're not, if you'd rather be somewhere else or doing something different, I want you to feel free to say so. You don't owe me anything just because I helped you." Margaret set down the mending, giving him her full attention. "I'm happier here than I've been in years, maybe happier than I've ever been. Why are you asking?" "Because I need to know if this arrangement is working for you." Fletcher leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You've been here over a month now, and I don't want you to feel trapped or obligated. You should have choices." "I choose to be here," Margaret said softly. "I choose this work, this life. I choose you." The words hung between them, more significant than she'd intended. Fletcher's expression shifted, something hopeful and uncertain flickering in his eyes. "Margaret, Her name was rough on his lips. "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable, but I can't keep pretending." Margaret's heart was racing. Pretending what? Pretending that this is just a working arrangement, pretending I don't feel more than I should. Fletcher stood, paced to the fireplace, stared into the flames. "You've become important to me. More than important. I look forward to seeing you every morning. I find excuses to be near you. I think about you constantly." He turned to face her. "I'm falling in love with you, maybe already have fallen, and I don't know what to do about it." Joy exploded in Margaret's chest, so intense it was almost painful. She stood, crossed to where Fletcher stood rigid by the fire, and took his hands in hers. "You could tell me you love me, because I love you too. Have loved you for weeks now, maybe since the beginning. You saved my life, Fletcher, and then you gave me a reason to live it. How could I not love you?" Fletcher's hands tightened on hers. "Are you sure? Because I'm not easy. I'm quiet and stubborn and set in my ways. I don't have much to offer except hard work and an uncertain future. You have integrity and kindness and strength. You see me as a person worth saving, worth keeping. You make me feel safe and valued and important." Margaret stepped closer. "That's everything, Fletcher. That's more than enough." Fletcher lifted one hand to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the calluses roughened by work. "I want to do this right. Court you properly with your father's blessing. Maybe marry you someday if you'll have me. Build a real life together." "I'll have you," Margaret whispered. "I'll have you right now if you want me." Fletcher's smile was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "I want you. God help me. I want you more than I've ever wanted anything." He kissed her then, soft and careful at first, then deeper as Margaret responded with equal fervor. It was her first real kiss, and it felt like everything she'd read about in books and never thought she'd experience. Fletcher's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Margaret melted into him, into the warmth and safety and love radiating from every point of contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "We'll do this properly. I'll talk to your father, ask his permission to court you. We'll take our time, do things right." "We've already been living together for over a month," Margaret pointed out. "I think we've skipped a few steps. All the more reason to do the rest by the book." But Fletcher was smiling, his eyes warm with promise. "I want everyone to know my intentions are honorable, that I'm going to marry you and spend the rest of my life making you happy." Margaret kissed him again, softer this time. "You already make me happy. But I'll let you do things properly if it's important to you." "It is. You deserve to be courted and wooed and treated like you're precious, because you are." Fletcher pulled her close again, held her against his chest. "I never thought I'd find this. Someone who fits into my life like you were always meant to be here." "I was meant to be here," Margaret said against his shirt. "If I hadn't almost died, if you hadn't found me, I never would have known what it felt like to be loved like this. That's a terrible thing to be grateful for." "Maybe, but I am grateful for all of it, even the pain, because it led me to you." They stood by the fire for a long time, holding each other, letting the reality of their feelings settle into something real and solid. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside they were warm and safe and happy. Together, Fletcher talked to Benjamin the next day, riding into town to formally ask permission to court Margaret. Benjamin gave his blessing readily, clearly relieved that his daughter had found someone worthy of her. The news spread through Westcliff quickly, and within a week, everyone knew that Fletcher Briggs was courting Margaret Vance with intentions of marriage. The courtship was unconventional given they already lived under the same roof, but Fletcher insisted on doing things right. He brought Margaret small gifts, ribbons for her hair, a new book she'd mentioned wanting, wildflowers he'd found growing in a sheltered area despite the winter cold. He took her on proper outings, riding into town for church socials or visiting neighbors together. He was unfailingly respectful, never pushing for more than she was comfortable with, though the attraction between them was palpable. Margaret had never been happier. The fear and uncertainty that had defined her life for so long had been replaced by joy and anticipation. She woke each morning excited to see Fletcher, to work alongside him, to share meals and conversations and stolen kisses when they were alone. The ranch work was hard but satisfying, and she took pride in her growing competence. Fletcher's praise meant everything to her, and she could see how much he valued her contributions. They planned for the future together, talking late into the night about expanding the ranch, maybe adding a room onto the cabin for children someday, building something that would last. Fletcher taught Margaret to ride her own horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, so she could move around the property independently. Margaret taught Fletcher to appreciate cooking beyond mere sustenance, experimenting with recipes and creating meals that were small celebrations. Valentine's Day arrived in February, and Fletcher surprised Margaret with a trip to the neighboring town of Salida, a day's ride away. They stayed at a respectable hotel with Margaret in her own room, had dinner at a proper restaurant, and Fletcher bought her a beautiful shawl from a shop that sold fine goods. It was the most romantic day of Margaret's life. That evening, walking along the street after dinner, Fletcher stopped under a gas lamp and pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we've only been courting officially for 6 weeks. I know most people would say it's too soon, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond. "Margaret Vance, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and partner and build a life with me?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." Fletcher slipped the ring onto her finger, kissed her there under the lamplight with snow falling gently around them, and Margaret felt like she was living in a dream. 6 weeks ago she'd been locked outside to die. Now she was engaged to a man she loved with her whole heart, with a future full of promise stretching ahead of them. They married in March, on the first day that truly felt like spring. It was a small ceremony in the Westcliff Church, with Benjamin giving Margaret away and half the town in attendance. Margaret wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Fletcher had bought her, simple but elegant in cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Fletcher wore his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face throughout the ceremony. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed her with such tenderness that Margaret felt her heart might burst from happiness. They held a small reception at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing, and Margaret danced with her new husband and her father, and felt surrounded by love and community in a way she'd never experienced before. That night, alone in their cabin that was now legally theirs together, Fletcher carried Margaret over the threshold and set her gently on her feet in front of the fire. "Hello, Mrs. Briggs," he said softly. "Hello, husband." Margaret reached up to touch his face. "I like how that sounds." "So do I." Fletcher pulled her close, kissed her deeply. "I promise to spend every day making sure you know you're loved, you're safe, you're home." "I know," Margaret whispered. "I've known since the night you brought me in from the cold." Their wedding night was gentle and sweet, Fletcher patient with Margaret's inexperience, both of them discovering the physical expression of their love with wonder and joy. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Margaret felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. "Tell me this is real," she said against Fletcher's chest. "Tell me I'm not going to wake up and find myself back in the shed, cold and alone. This is real." Fletcher's arms tightened around her. "You're my wife, you're safe, and I'm never letting anyone hurt you again." Margaret believed him. For the first time in years, she believed in happy endings. Spring arrived in full force, bringing with it the busy season of ranch work. Margaret threw herself into learning everything Fletcher could teach her. She helped with the cattle during calving season, staying up through long nights to assist with difficult births. She learned to rope and brand, to recognize signs of illness or injury in the herd. Fletcher treated her like a true partner, valuing her opinions and trusting her judgment. They worked together in a harmony that felt natural, as if they'd been ranching together for years instead of months. Neighbors commented on it, how well matched they seemed, how the Briggs ranch was thriving under their joint management. Fletcher hired on a hand named Johnny to help with the heavier work. A young man of 19 with big dreams and little experience, and Margaret found herself teaching him alongside Fletcher. "You're good at this," Fletcher told her one evening as they watched Johnny successfully rope a calf on his third try. "Teaching, being patient, he listens to you. He's a good kid, reminds me of myself wanting to learn and prove his worth." Margaret leaned against the fence rail. "We all need someone to believe in us." Fletcher turned to look at her, his expression soft. "I believe in you more than you know, I know." Margaret smiled at him. "You show me every day." Summer brought long days and hard work, but also joy. Margaret's friendship with Mrs. Henderson deepened, the old woman treating her like a granddaughter and teaching her things about ranching she'd learned over decades. Benjamin visited when he could, clearly happy to see his daughter thriving. And Margaret and Fletcher built their life together, one day at a time, one shared experience at a time. They had their first real argument in July, over whether to buy more cattle or invest in better fencing. It wasn't a terrible fight, but it was heated, both of them stubborn and convinced they were right. They went to bed angry, lying on opposite sides of the mattress in stiff silence. Margaret woke in the middle of the night to find Fletcher sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "Fletcher," she sat up, concerned. "What's wrong? I hate fighting with you." His voice was rough. "I hate going to bed angry. I kept thinking about how close I came to never having you at all, how you could have died in that snow, and here I am wasting our time together being stubborn about cattle and fences." Margaret moved to sit beside him, took his hand. "We can disagree sometimes. That's normal. It doesn't mean we love each other less." "I know, but I don't want to." Fletcher turned to face her. "I'm sorry. You were right about the fencing. We need to secure what we have before expanding. I was just being bullheaded. And I'm sorry for how I said it. I could have been gentler." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out together. We always do." They made love then, gentle and affirming, and fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. In the morning, they bought better fencing materials and agreed to revisit the cattle question in a year. It was a compromise that made them both happy, and Margaret filed away the lesson. Communication and willingness to bend were more important than being right. Fall arrived with its riot of colors, and with it came news that made Margaret's heart skip. She was pregnant. Dr. Morrison in town confirmed it, and Margaret rode home in a daze, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, trying to process the reality of new life growing inside her. She told Fletcher that evening over dinner, too nervous to be subtle. "I saw Dr. Morrison today." Fletcher looked up from his plate, immediately concerned. "Are you sick? Hurt?" "No, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." Fletcher's fork clattered to his plate. For a long moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he was out of his chair and pulling her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said against her hair. "We're having a baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, suddenly uncertain. Fletcher pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were wet. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it. You've given me everything, Margaret. A home, a partner, and now a child. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that I found you in that snow." They held each other for a long time, overwhelmed by the enormity of it. A baby. Their baby. A new life created from their love. The pregnancy was difficult at times. Margaret suffered from severe morning sickness in the early months, and Fletcher hovered over her constantly, worried and protective. But she was strong and healthy, and Dr. Morrison assured them everything was progressing normally. Fletcher insisted she do less heavy work, and though Margaret protested, she secretly appreciated his care. Winter returned, and with it the anniversary of the night Fletcher had found her. They spent Christmas Day quietly at home, Margaret now noticeably pregnant, the cabin warm and decorated with pine boughs and candles. Fletcher had carved a wooden cradle, working on it in secret for weeks, and he presented it to her on Christmas morning. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, running her hands over the smooth wood. "Our baby will sleep here. Safe and warm," Fletcher added. "Never cold, never afraid, never unwanted." Margaret heard the echo of her own past in his words and understood. Their child would have everything they could provide: love, security, a home where they belonged. It was a gift more precious than anything that could be bought. "I was thinking," Fletcher said, sitting beside her on the sofa, "about this time last year, about how you came into my life. It's hard to believe it's only been a year." "It feels like forever," Margaret agreed. "Like I've always been here with you. You'll always be here with me from now on." Fletcher took her hand, brought it to his lips. "You and our baby, my family." Margaret thought about the word family. How it had once meant warmth and safety with her mother. How it had come to mean cruelty and fear with Constance. And how Fletcher had redefined it for her, made it mean love and partnership and belonging. "We're your family," she said softly. "Always." Benjamin visited in early January, bringing gifts for the coming baby and obvious excitement at becoming a grandfather. He looked better than he had in years, his face less gaunt, his step lighter. Over dinner, he made an announcement. "I'm leaving the mines," he said. "I've saved enough and I'm tired of being underground. I bought a small piece of land just outside town, going to try my hand at farming, be around for my grandchild." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Papa, that's wonderful. Should have done it years ago. If I had, maybe Constance never would have happened. Maybe you wouldn't have suffered." Benjamin's expression turned regretful. "I have a lot to make up for." "You don't," Margaret said firmly. "What's past is past. We're all looking forward now." Benjamin stayed for a week, helping Fletcher with winter work and clearly enjoying getting to know his son-in-law better. When he left, he hugged Margaret tight and whispered, "You chose well, daughter. He's a good man." "I know," Margaret whispered back. "I'm lucky." "No, he's the lucky one. He got you." The baby came in late April, during a spring storm that rattled the windows and made the world outside wild and alive. Margaret's labor was long and difficult, 12 hours of pain and effort while Fletcher held her hand and Dr. Morrison coached her through it. But finally, as dawn broke and the storm cleared, their son entered the world with a lusty cry. Fletcher wept openly when Dr. Morrison placed the baby in his arms, staring down at the tiny red-faced infant with awe. "He's perfect. Margaret, look at him. He's perfect." Margaret, exhausted but elated, held out her arms for her son. The baby had Fletcher's dark hair and her delicate features, a perfect blend of them both. "What should we name him?" They'd discussed names for months but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Fletcher said, "What about William? William Benjamin, after both our fathers." "William Benjamin Briggs," Margaret repeated. "I love it. Hello, William. Welcome to the world." William proved to be a healthy baby with strong lungs and an insatiable appetite. Margaret recovered from the birth quickly, her strength built up from years of hard work serving her well. Fletcher was a devoted father, taking to parenthood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. He changed nappies and walked the floor with William during fussy nights, and stared at his son like he couldn't quite believe something so miraculous existed. The ranch work continued with Johnny taking on more responsibility, while Margaret focused on the baby. But by William's 3-month birthday, she was back to helping outside, carrying William in a sling against her chest while she worked. Fletcher protested at first, worried about her doing too much, but Margaret insisted. "This is our life," she told him. "William is part of it. He'll grow up knowing what it means to work hard and build something, just like we did." Summer that year was beautiful, warm and clear, and Margaret spent long hours outside with William, teaching him to see the world around him even though he was too young to understand. She told him stories about the ranch, about his father's skill with horses, about his grandfather working his new farm. She sang him songs her mother had sung to her, passing down that legacy of love. One evening in August, sitting on the porch with William asleep in her arms and Fletcher beside her watching the sunset, Margaret felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "What are you thinking?" Fletcher asked, noticing her expression. "That I'm happy, truly, completely happy." Margaret looked at him. "2 years ago I was locked outside to die. Now I'm here with you and our son, watching the sunset, and I can't imagine a more perfect life." Fletcher leaned over to kiss her forehead. "It's not perfect. The cattle market is uncertain, the weather's unpredictable, and I'm pretty sure William just spit up on your shoulder." Margaret laughed. "All right, it's not perfect, but it's ours, and that makes it perfect enough." "Perfect enough," Fletcher agreed. "I'll take it." William's first birthday arrived, and they held a small party with Benjamin, Mrs. Henderson, Johnny, and a few neighbors. William smashed cake all over his face while everyone laughed, and Margaret captured the moment in her mind, wanting to remember this joy forever. She thought about the family she'd lost, and the family she'd gained, about the journey from that frozen Christmas Eve to this warm spring celebration, and felt grateful for every step of the path, even the painful ones. That night, after everyone had left and William was asleep in his carved cradle, Fletcher pulled Margaret into his arms. "I have something to tell you." Margaret looked up at him. "What is it?" "I bought the Henderson place. Mrs. Henderson is moving to live with her daughter in Denver, and she wanted us to have the property. It adjoins ours on the western border, adds another 150 acres to our ranch." Fletcher's eyes were bright with excitement. "We can expand like we've been planning. Build something bigger for William to inherit someday." Margaret threw her arms around his neck. "Fletcher, that's amazing. When did this happen?" "Been negotiating for a few weeks. Didn't want to say anything until it was final." He held her close. "This ranch is growing, Margaret. Because of you, because of us working together. We're building something real." "We are," Margaret agreed. "A legacy for William and for any other children we might have." Fletcher pulled back to look at her. "You want more children, don't you?" "I want everything with you." Fletcher kissed her deeply. "As many children as we're blessed with, as many years as God gives us, all of it." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that still sparked between them, creating new life in the process, though they wouldn't know it for several more weeks. The ranch continued to thrive. With the additional land from the Henderson property, Fletcher and Margaret expanded their cattle operation significantly. They hired another hand, a former soldier named Thomas who'd served in the Indian Wars and was looking to settle down. Between Thomas, Johnny, and their own labor, they built the ranch into one of the most successful operations in the region. Margaret became pregnant again in the fall, and their daughter was born the following June. They named her Elizabeth Rose after both their mothers, and she had Margaret's blonde hair and Fletcher's dark eyes. William, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. The years passed in a blur of work and love and growing family. Margaret and Fletcher celebrated their 5th anniversary with a trip to Denver, leaving the children with Benjamin for a week. It was their first time alone since, before William was born, and they reveled in the freedom while also missing their children terribly. "We've built a good life," Margaret said as they walked through Denver's busy streets, her hand tucked into Fletcher's arm. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's real. It's real." Fletcher stopped, turned her to face him. "You made it real. You brought life and warmth to that cold house. You gave me a reason to build something lasting. Everything good in my life comes from you." "That's not true. You saved me first." "We saved each other," Fletcher said. "That's what love does." They returned home to find William had learned to ride a pony by himself, and Elizabeth had taken her first steps. Benjamin, who'd become a regular fixture at the ranch, was bursting with pride over both achievements. The house was full of noise and chaos and laughter, and Margaret stood in the doorway taking it all in, feeling blessed beyond measure. More years passed. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. Elizabeth was bright and spirited, always asking questions and exploring. Margaret taught them both to read and do sums. Fletcher taught them about cattle and horses and the land. They were good children, happy and secure, growing up knowing they were loved. In their 10th year of marriage, Margaret became pregnant again, a surprise as she'd thought their family was complete. This time, twins arrived, 2 boys they named James and Samuel. The house became even more chaotic, but it was a happy chaos, full of children's laughter and the sounds of family. Fletcher hired more help as the ranch grew, building additional structures and expanding into horse breeding alongside the cattle operation. Margaret managed the household and the books, proving to have a head for numbers that complemented Fletcher's instincts for ranching. They were a true partnership, each bringing their strengths to build something neither could have achieved alone. On their 15th anniversary, Fletcher surprised Margaret with a new house. Not replacing the original cabin, but built nearby, larger and more comfortable, with separate bedrooms for the children and modern conveniences. "This is where we started," Fletcher said, standing with Margaret in the doorway of the original cabin. "Where you came back to life. Where we fell in love. I don't want to tear it down." "What will we do with it?" Margaret asked. "Keep it as a reminder of where we came from, what we survived, how far we've come." Fletcher pulled her close. "And maybe someday one of our children will want it, turn it back into a home." They moved into the new house, but kept the cabin maintained and furnished. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Margaret would walk over and sit by the fireplace where Fletcher had first brought her back from the cold, remembering that desperate night and everything that had followed. She'd thank God and fate and Fletcher's kind heart for giving her this life, this love, this family. The children grew. William announced at 16 that he wanted to attend agricultural college to learn modern ranching techniques. Fletcher supported the decision fully, proud of his son's ambition. Elizabeth proved to have a gift for art, filling the house with drawings and paintings of the ranch and landscape. The twins were still young but showing signs of inheriting their parents' work ethic and their brother's thoughtfulness. Benjamin lived to see all his grandchildren grow, passing peacefully in his sleep at 72. Margaret mourned him deeply, but took comfort in knowing he'd spent his final years surrounded by family, making peace with his mistakes, proud of what his daughter had built. Margaret and Fletcher aged gracefully, their faces weathering with time but their love only deepening. They'd weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, supported each other through losses, and celebrated victories together. The ranch they'd built became a landmark in the region, known for quality cattle and horses and fair dealing. On their 25th anniversary, their children organized a surprise party. Half the county attended, celebrating the couple who'd become pillars of the community. There were speeches and toasts, music and dancing, and through it all Margaret held Fletcher's hand and marveled at the journey they'd taken together. Late that night, alone in their bedroom after the last guest had left, Fletcher pulled Margaret into his arms. They were both in their late 40s now, their bodies marked by time and hard work, but Margaret had never felt more beautiful than when Fletcher looked at her with that expression of absolute love. 25 years, he said softly, since I found you in the snow, since you saved my life. Since you saved mine. Fletcher kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. I was alive but not living before you, just going through the motions, building something without understanding why. You gave me purpose. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything, Margaret corrected. That's what partnership means. They made love that night with the practiced ease of long familiarity, their bodies knowing each other perfectly, their hearts in perfect sync. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Fletcher's steady breathing beside her, Margaret thought about that desperate girl locked outside in the blizzard, thinking she was going to die alone and unloved. If she could go back and tell that girl what was waiting for her, just 2 miles away riding through the snow, would it have made the pain easier to bear? Would it have given her hope? Margaret liked to think so. Because the truth was that salvation often came from unexpected places, from strangers who chose kindness, from love that bloomed in the aftermath of cruelty. Fletcher had brought her in from the cold, but she'd brought warmth to his life in return. They'd made each other whole. The years continued to pass, bringing new grandchildren and new challenges and new joys. William married a school teacher named Sarah and took over more of the daily ranch operations. Elizabeth studied art in Denver and returned to open a studio in Westcliff. The twins, growing into young men, showed interest in expanding the ranch's horse breeding program. Margaret and Fletcher transitioned into elder statesman roles, still involved but letting the younger generation take the lead. They spent their days working in the garden Margaret had cultivated over decades, taking long rides across their land, and enjoying time with their expanding family. On a spring morning much like the one when William had been born, Margaret woke to find Fletcher propped on one elbow, watching her with that same expression of wonder he'd worn on their wedding night. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Just thinking about how lucky I am, how lucky we are." Fletcher traced her face with gentle fingers. "We could have missed each other completely. If I'd taken a different route home that night, if I'd been 5 minutes later, if you'd frozen 5 minutes sooner, we nearly didn't happen. But we did happen." Margaret caught his hand, pressed it to her heart. "We found each other when we both needed finding, and we built something beautiful. We did." Fletcher leaned down to kiss her. "I love you, Margaret Briggs, today and every day for the rest of our lives. I love you too. Always have, always will." They rose and went about their day, tending the life they'd built together. In the afternoon, their children and grandchildren arrived for Sunday dinner, a tradition they'd maintained for years. The house filled with noise and chaos and love. 3 generations gathered around the table Margaret had set with care. Looking around at all the faces, seeing the love and security that defined this family, Margaret caught Fletcher's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that quiet smile that was hers alone, and she felt her heart swell with gratitude. This was what they'd built. Not just a successful ranch or financial security, but family. Legacy. Love that would continue long after they were gone, passed down through their children and grandchildren. The seeds of kindness they'd planted bearing fruit in ways they couldn't even imagine. That night, after everyone had left and quiet had returned to the house, Margaret and Fletcher walked out to the original cabin. It was maintained but empty now, a memorial to their beginning. They sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, holding hands like they'd done 1,000 times before. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if I hadn't found you?" Fletcher asked quietly. "Sometimes. But it always makes me sad to imagine." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I'd rather think about what did happen, how you brought me in from the cold and gave me a family, how we built this life together, how love saved us both." "Love saved us both," Fletcher repeated. "I like that." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd weathered every storm together and come out stronger for it. The ranch stretched around them in the darkness, full of sleeping cattle and horses, the land they'd worked and loved and built upon. Inside the main house, their children's rooms waited for visits, testament to the family they'd created. Margaret thought about endings and beginnings, about how the worst night of her life had led to the best years. She thought about the girl she'd been, and the woman she'd become, about Fletcher finding her in the snow and everything that had followed. She thought about love and resilience and the power of choosing kindness even when the world had been cruel. "Thank you," she said softly, "for saving me, for loving me, for making me family." Fletcher turned to look at her, his weathered face beautiful in the starlight. "Thank you for letting me, for choosing me, for building this life with me. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret, the very best thing." They kissed then, soft and sweet, a promise renewed. When they finally returned to the main house and climbed into their bed, Margaret fell asleep wrapped in Fletcher's arms, content and complete. She'd been left outside during the Christmas freeze, abandoned to die in the snow. But a cowboy had brought her in and made her family, and together they'd built something that would last forever. Their love story became local legend, told and retold over the years. The couple who'd found each other during a blizzard and built an empire on love and hard work. Young couples looked to them as an example of true partnership, and old-timers spoke with respect about the Briggs Ranch and the people who'd created it. Years later, when Margaret and Fletcher were both in their 70s, still active and engaged despite their age, a young woman came to their door. She was desperate and pregnant, thrown out by her family with nowhere to go. Margaret and Fletcher took her in without hesitation, gave her shelter and support, helped her find her footing. They remembered what it was like to need kindness, to be saved by someone's choice to help. The woman eventually moved on to build her own life, but she named her daughter Margaret Elizabeth in honor of the couple who'd shown her what family could mean. It was their legacy extending forward, proof that kindness rippled outward in ways that lasted generations. Margaret Briggs passed away peacefully at 78, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her hand held tight in Fletcher's. Her last words were, "Thank you for finding me in the snow." Fletcher followed her 6 months later, unable to live long without his partner, his love, his heart. He was buried beside her on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, under a sky that stretched forever. Their children and grandchildren continued the ranch, expanding it further while maintaining the values Margaret and Fletcher had instilled. The original cabin was preserved as a family museum, a reminder of where it all began. And the story of the cowboy who'd brought a dying woman in from the cold and made her family lived on, a testament to the power of love, kindness, and choosing to save someone when you could just as easily have ridden past. In the end, that was Margaret and Fletcher's true legacy. Not the land or the cattle or the financial success, but the proof that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, that family was built not just by blood but by choice, and that sometimes the worst night of your life was really the beginning of something beautiful. They'd found each other when both were lost, and together they'd created a love story that would be remembered for generations. A reminder that hope survived even in the coldest, darkest moments, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it in from the freeze and give it warmth.